Welcome, everyone. Richard will cover the World War II and the Pacific, 6 easy lessons about World War II. We welcome you. Please enter your questions into the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen, and any technical questions only into the chat box. Welcome, Richard Brooke.
There we go. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the 4th seminar in this series about the war in the Pacific. I'm glad you could join us this week. Let me set up my screen share here so that we can make this work. And that should put the screen share on, and I'll make it full screen. And got to turn on my camera. Okay. You should have my camera on now. I should not be muted, and you should have my PowerPoint presentation up live on your screen. I think that's the way this is working. Again, welcome, and welcome to lecture number 4. The first 3 weeks of this seminar, we covered the chronology of the war in the Pacific. I hope everyone enjoyed that. This week, and from this point going forward, we're going to do a deep dive into some interesting key aspects of the war. And I think one of the ones that I always like reading about are some of the stories of some of the key people who were important in our road to victory. So I thought I would cover that in this week's session. So I thought we would talk about some of those people that were key in the victory in the Pacific. Not covered in today's seminar, however, are probably the most important group of people that were necessary to win the war, and that is not even the soldiers. The people who were the most important actually were the millions of men and women, and in some cases children, who went to work in the war industries back here in the United States. 100% of our economic output, almost virtually 100% of our economic output, was converted from civilian to military purposes literally overnight when Pearl Harbor was attacked. Millions upon millions of people entered the workforce. It was often the first time many women ever entered the workforce, but everybody went to work building something associated with the war effort. They learned how to weld airplanes, ships. They learned how to put things together they would never in 1,000 years have thought they would be putting together. They were building guns and bombs, everything you can imagine, all put together mostly by a civilian workforce. And it wasn't just Americans who were involved in this. You know, Canada did exactly the same thing. Of course, most of their war materials were going to Europe as opposed to the US, which was sharing war materials not only with the Europe, but also in the Pacific, and not only sharing them with ourselves, but also with many of our allies. But, you know, we can also thank the citizens of Mexico, because millions of Mexicans came across the border and took jobs in these war industries. They went to work on farms to grow food for us, while many American farmers had gone to work in the war industry. So Mexico helped out tremendously. Even Central and South America was involved. Countries mobilized from one end of North America to the southern tip of South America, all making war materials. And in fact, I should just say before we get started that the Brazilians were so heavily involved in making war materials for us that they got many of their merchant ships that were traveling north from ports in Brazil to the United States to bring material up here before it went to Europe or to the Pacific. A lot of those ships were being sunk by U-boats. The Brazilians got so angry at the Germans about it, because they were really not in the war, but the Germans were busy sinking Brazilian ships, and Brazil decided to actually send an army to Italy. So there was actually a Brazilian army. It wasn't that big, but it was a Brazilian army that went to fight in Italy alongside the Americans. So it really was an international effort. And these are the people that really were responsible for winning not only the war in Europe, but also for sure the war in the Pacific. But today we want to cover some of the people whose stories are not necessarily well known amongst the population. So I want to talk about these people against the canvas of this Pacific War, which, as we know, was vast. We know the war started abruptly and violently. We know that America was ill prepared. And suddenly, on the day that Pearl Harbor was attacked, we found that our entire Pacific fleet was sitting on the bottom of the harbor. And as you know, the country descended literally into panic. The government and military were caught flat-footed. And if they were flat-footed, the people, excuse me, who were living on the West Coast were downright petrified. Day and night, calls were pouring in about phantom Japanese invasion fleets that were arriving at places up and down the West Coast, preparing to invade and to bomb our cities. This was really a panic. But, you know, with time, we recovered. It took time, and it cost a lot of lives before we turned things around. We sacrificed a huge amount of treasure, but in the end, as you know, we prevailed. So today I want to talk about some of the people who helped us prevail, because their stories are quite important. Along the way, those people were responsible for organizing more than 50 invasions of islands in the Pacific that were required to take before we could push the Japanese back to the Japanese homelands. That's 50 D-days that had to be planned and provisioned, a Herculean effort. Ships and weapons had to be built. The partnership between the government and civilian corporations was immense and involved literally the entire population of the United States and North America. So the first person I'd like to begin with, though, is the person who was responsible for the Navy on that fateful day in December of 1941. There we go. This man,
Excuse
Ernst
me, Richard.
King. Yeah.
On your screen, there should be a hide button. Can you click that? Thank you.
Got it? Okay, good. So the first person I want to talk about is Ernst King. He was commander-in-chief of the U.S. fleet. He was the chief of naval operations, and he was also a member of the Joint Chiefs under George Marshall. He hailed from Ohio and had attended the Naval Academy. During the Spanish-American War at the end of the 1890s, he was still attending the Naval Academy, but he took time off to join the fight. He commanded a destroyer when the U.S. and Mexico squared off in early 1914, and he helped with the occupation of Veracruz, which ended just before World War I was starting. As you know, America had a little spat with Mexico before World War I. Now, during World War I, he was a staff officer working for the commander of the Atlantic Fleet. And after World War I, King served as the head of the Naval Postgraduate School, commanded a submarine squadron, and even served as chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics. In February of 1941, just 9 months before Pearl Harbor, he assumed command of the Atlantic Fleet. And after a period on the Navy's General Board, King became commander of the Atlantic Fleet in February of 1941. With the attack on Pearl Harbor, he became commander-in-chief of the United States Fleet, and he became the chief of naval operations in March of 1942. So it was King who really oversaw the Navy for much of the war, making him key to its expansion and the key to its success. He made the decision to appoint Nimitz as overall commander in the Pacific, and he's also the one who kept Douglas MacArthur in check and kept him from having any success in his endless attempts to take over the conduct of the war. King had been in submarines, and he also was involved in naval aviation. It's a good thing because these parts of the Navy were going to prove to be very important. His efforts were totally key in World War II. He survived the war but passed away in 1956, which brings us to the next person I want to talk about, a guy by the name of Charles Swede Mommsen. Now, some of the people I'm going to talk about today were pretty smart. Swede Mommsen was one of them. He played an absolutely critical role in the development and design of American submarines, which were so important during World War II. He was born in 1896 in Long Island. They called him Swede, but oddly enough, he was of actually Danish descent. Go figure. He went to the Naval Academy in 1916. In World War I, he served on a battleship in the summer of 1918 on the USS Kansas. After the war, in 1921, he got involved in submarines after training at the naval base in New London, Connecticut. He was a sub commander at a time when our subs were both small and dangerous. And in 1929, he moved to the design division of the Bureau of Construction and Repair within the Navy to help improve those very designs. By 1932, he developed a method for submariners to exit a sub from deep underwater and reach the surface in the case of an emergency. You see a picture of it here in the lower right-hand corner. He developed something called the Momsen lung. It was a bag that a submariner wore around their chest, like you see this person wearing here. And as they made an emergency ascent from a stricken sub from deep underwater, the Momsen lung allowed the user to breathe and breathe normally during the ascent. Now, if you try to hold your breath on the way up from 200 feet, your lungs are going to explode. So with the Momsen lung, you could safely ascend and breathe and not kill yourself, something that's pretty important if you want to try to get off that sub. Rather important to that process, in fact, is being able to escape with enough air so that you can reach the surface, and this is what the Momsen lung allowed you to do. In fact, a version of this Momsen lung is still, to this day, the standard safety equipment carried on every sub on every Navy on the planet. And for his lung, he received the Distinguished Service Medal, the citation, which reads in part, "During the early stages of the lung's design and development, he courageously, repeatedly, and voluntarily risked his life in conducting experiments of a nature that there was little or no information available as to their probable results. In the latter tests on the device, when escapes were made from the USS S4, which is the name of the sub, submerged at depths as much as 206 feet, he was not only the first person to venture the escape, but also the leading and guiding spirit of all subsequent ones." That's what the document read. In August of 1937, he became the officer in charge of experimental diving at the Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. And while there, he developed a new set of decompression tables that to this day are still used by scuba divers and by saturation divers who spend weeks diving at depths of up to 400 feet. Swede figured out how to keep divers safe by taking out the oxygen and nitrogen from air and replacing it with helium. These mixtures, these special mixtures, are called heliox mixtures. And the Navy dive tables that he created are still, as I said, in use every single day by both recreational and saturation divers around the world, all as a result of his pioneering work. When disaster struck, when he was stationed in Washington, as a U.S. submarine called the Squalus sank in approximately 240 feet of water off Newport, Rhode Island in May of 1939. Swede supervised the rescue of using a diving bell that he had helped design and build the previous year. Attaching the diving bell to the top of the Squalus, they were able to save 33 of the crew and get them out safely. Swede was reassigned to Pearl Harbor in 1939, and this is shockingly when his career really took off. In July of 42, he was designated as Assistant Chief of Staff and War Plans Officer. In February of 43, he became commander of the Submarine Squadron Number 2. You may recall, by the way, from one of my previous seminars that I mentioned that the main U.S. torpedo, the Mark 14 as it was called, in the early part of the war was plagued with problems. When Swede Momsen took over as commander of Sub Squadron 2, he decided to get to the bottom of the problem in his own unique way. He had one of his subs fire all their torpedoes at a cliff on the edge of the island of Oahu. And it didn't take long before a number of duds were left scattered along the bottom. Swede descended himself to retrieve these fully armed and highly dangerous duds all by himself by tying a rope around the end and having them hoisted aboard. He took them apart and figured out that the detonator was indeed defective, and in fact, he figured out why it was defective. Now, at the time, the Ordnance Department had previously, from December of 1941 through August of 43, refused to even admit that the design might have a flaw, and instead were blaming the sub-captains for not shooting their torpedoes properly. So it was one of these things where each side was blaming the other. But when Swede was able to produce and reproduce the broken detonators, the Ordnance Department had no choice but to agree that the design was really the problem, which, as you know, they soon fixed. And for this, Swede received even more awards from the Navy. But more importantly, the Navy was immediately able to vastly increase the number of Japanese shipping being sent to the bottom, hastening the demise of the enemy and saving countless lives. He was awarded the Navy Cross, the Legion of Merit, a gold star in lieu of a second Legion of Merit with a Combat V. And before the war was over, he was awarded so many additional medals and citations that it would take the rest of today to go through them all. He retired in the 1950s as an admiral. Not bad for a guy named Swede, who was actually of Danish descent. The next guy to talk about was also in submarines, Admiral Charles Lockwood. Lockwood wasn't as colorful as Swede Mommsen, but he was really important to submarine warfare in the Pacific. He graduated from the Naval Academy during World War I, and he was a sub-commander right at the end of the war and spent much of the war period between the wars studying submarine doctrine from captured German U-boats that they had grabbed during World War I. In June of 1939, he became Chief of Staff to the commander of the submarine force of the U.S. fleet. And in February of 1941, when he was sent to London as a naval attaché and principal observer for submarines to see if the British had improved on any of their own ideas to defend against new World War II U-boats that were then sinking merchant ships at an alarming rate during the Battle of the Atlantic. So after Pearl Harbor, he became Rear Admiral, and in May of 1942, he arrived in Perth in Western Australia as Commander of Submarines, Southwest Pacific. In fact, for the entire war, the United States had a submarine base that's in Perth, and today in Perth, the Australians have their main submarine base at that same place in Perth, Australia. Lockwood, in February of 1943, was the obvious choice to replace Rear Admiral Robert Henry English as the commander of the entire Pacific Fleet in the Pacific when English died in a plane crash in California. Lockwood from Pearl Harbor worked next to Admiral Nimitz for the duration of the war as Commander Submarines Pacific Fleet, and under his command, the force grew to nearly 300 subs patrolling the Pacific. His real skill was in molding a fleet of hundreds of newly constructed fleet submarines from American shipyards and seeing them manned and trained with highly skilled officers and men. Lockwood was really good at getting rid of deadwood, replacing timid and unproductive submarine skippers with usually younger and more aggressive officers. As a result of Lockwood's initiatives, the silent service, as they called the submarine service, began racking up many kills, including key enemy warships. Most importantly, U.S. subs were responsible for severing Japan's shipping routes, leaving many garrisons of thousands of Japanese sitting around on small islands with little or no food and no way to get home. If the island couldn't be resupplied, and it usually had to be resupplied by submarine, it didn't need to be invaded. So under Lockwood's direction, U.S. subs sank close to half of all of Japan's merchant ships. Many island invasions never had to happen because the Japanese on these remote islands just began to starve, couldn't be resupplied. After the war, he became an author of many excellent books on World War II, which are part of my reading list that you'll see. We'll talk about at the end of the seminar this week. The next guy I want to talk about is someone whose name everyone should recognize, Butch O'Hare. After all, Chicago's main airport is named for him. O'Hare was born in St. Louis, Missouri. Butch's father was a lawyer who worked closely with Al Capone before turning against him and helping convict Capone of tax evasion. Capone likely had Butch's father killed in 1939 for providing evidence against him during his 1932 trial. So in 1933, Butch O'Hare entered the Naval Academy in Annapolis and graduated in 1937. He went on to train in Corsairs and on TBD Devastators, two different types of planes. After completing his training in May of 1940, he was assigned to the USS Saratoga and learned to fly the Grumman F-3F. O'Hare was a natural flyer. Early on in the war, in January of 1942, the Saratoga was damaged by a Japanese torpedo hit while patrolling southwest of Hawaii. She spent 5 months in repair on the West Coast, so Butch's group was transferred to the Lexington on January 31st. Just a few weeks later, And only 10 weeks after Pearl Harbor, on February 20th of 1942, he became the Navy's first flying ace when he single-handedly attacked a formation of 9 heavy bombers approaching the Lexington. Despite being low on ammunition, he was credited with shooting down 5 of the enemy bombers and became the first naval recipient of the Medal of Honor in World War II. O'Hare's luck unfortunately ran out in November of 1943, while on a night attack, his Grumman F-6F Hellcat was shot down. Unfortunately, his body was never recovered. In his honor, after the war, on September the 19th of 1949, Chicago's Orchard Depot Road Airport, with the airport code ORD, was renamed O'Hare International. And an F-4F Wildcat in livery identical to the plane that was flown by Butch is on display in Terminal 2. If you ever go to Terminal 2, look around for the plane that's hanging from the ceiling. The display was formally opened on the 75th anniversary of his Medal of Honor flight. Next up is Bull Halsey. Simply put, Admiral Bill Halsey was to the Pacific as General George Patton was to Europe. He got his nickname from an accidental typo in a message where someone replaced the I with a U, and Bull stuck. He rather liked it. Halsey was born into a Navy family, and like his father before him, he attended the Naval Academy, graduating in his case in 1904. In the years to follow, he accumulated an enormous amount of experience. From 1909 to 1932, he was the captain of 12 different torpedo boats and destroyers, commanded 3 destroyer divisions, served as executive officer on the battleship Wyoming. On shore, he did stints in naval intelligence at Annapolis and was even the naval attaché in Europe in the 1920s. With naval aviation becoming more important, Halsey commanded carrier divisions in both the Atlantic and the Pacific. By June of 1940, Vice Admiral Halsey at the time had command of America's Pacific Carrier Fleet based in Hawaii, and this was the Plum peacetime carrier assignment. It also became his wartime ticket to fame. Halsey left Pearl Harbor on November 28, 1941, with the Enterprise and the Hornet to deliver a load of planes to Wake Island. When the Japanese visited Pearl Harbor, he was therefore out of town. As he arrived back on December the 8th, Halsey glowered at the wreckage and exclaimed, "Before we're through with them, the Japanese language will be spoken only in hell." And this was sort of his attitude about the situation throughout the whole war. Nimitz could count on Halsey to aggressively pursue the enemy. Nimitz's job, he knew, was on the line. He needed success, and Halsey brought him exactly what he needed. Right from the start of the war, despite having minimal assets to fight with, Halsey had no problem charging off to attack the Gilbert and Marshall Islands along with Wake, all before March of 1942. So just in the few months after the war, when literally there was nothing to fight with except what Halsey had with him, off he went. They weren't inflicting much damage, but at least they were on the attack. Halsey was in command of the Doolittle raid in April of 42. This brought him even more notoriety, and his fame just grew from there. Now, like Patton, he could be abrasive, and he could and would make mistakes, but he learned from his errors, and he knew on a visceral level, as did Patton, I might add, that the way to minimize the cost of war and lives was to attack, and attack even harder when you saw that the enemy was in retreat. Now, Halsey was in the hospital with a skin disease during the Battle of Midway, as we know. Replacing him, Nimitz took Halsey's recommendation, and they selected Ray Spruance to command Halsey's, who had been the commander of Halsey's screening ships and had proved quite capable of keeping up with him in every way. So it was Spruance who was in command when Japan lost 4 of their frontline carriers at Midway. But by mid-October, Halsey had taken over from Admiral Gormley, who had abandoned the Marines on Guadalcanal. Gormley had to go. Halsey took over as the commander in the South Pacific, essentially the area where the bulk of the fighting was going to take place. When the Japanese launched their huge attack against Guadalcanal in October of 42, Halsey extorted his commanders, "Strike, repeat, strike." That was the message. And he sent out by radio, in clear message, I might add, "We are here to kill Japs. and kill more Japs. The vintage Halsey. Halsey supported the fight with everything he had. The Wasp and the Hornet were lost. The Enterprise was badly damaged. If Guadalcanal had been lost to the Japanese, he probably would have been out of a job. And maybe Nimitz might have lost his job as well, but they prevailed. They won, and history writes it differently. After Guadalcanal and the Solipans were subdued in February of 43, Halsey became the master of the leapfrog strategy. With more than 50 invasions to come, it doesn't seem like leapfrogging, but it really was leapfrogging. They left out as many islands as they hit, and they only hit the ones that they knew were strategic, leaving the ones that had no airstrips, that were not strategic, to starve in the behind the lines. But in truth, it was still 50 invasions that he had to manage. The Japanese could simply not compete against what became our ever more powerful American fleets, and nor could they match Halsey's aggressiveness, especially after Yamamoto was killed in April of 43. The Japanese were confused when Halsey and Spruance started rotating their command of the same fleet. Remember, I explained that last week. When Spruance was in charge of the fleet, it was the 5th Fleet. When Halsey was in charge, it was the 3rd Fleet. The Japanese thought that we had twice the size of the ships that we had, but in fact, it turned out very well for both, because while one was planning, the other was fighting. When the force was part of Spruance's 5th Fleet, the carrier task force was commanded by Mark Mitcher and bore the designated task force number 58. When led by Halsey as part of the 3rd Fleet, the carrier force was commanded by Vice Admiral John S. McCain Sr., and its designation was Task Force 38. By 1944, Halsey's command was 10 times bigger than what it was in 1942. As South Pacific commander, he had 3 carrier and 2 battleships in each of 4 different task forces, 3 times as many ships in each one as his single task force in 1942. There was nothing on Earth to match Task Force 38, except the possible exception of Task Force 58, which turns out was exactly the same ships. And he fought all the way to Japan. He made mistakes. He was desperate to shoot. He desperately wanted a shot at the remaining Japanese fleet that he took, and he took off after them during the Battle of Leyte Gulf, leaving the landing beaches exposed to a counterattack. It wasn't totally his fault, but he should have known better. He also managed to sail the entire task force into a typhoon in December of 1944. In that one typhoon, 1,000 men were lost, along with 3 destroyers, the Spence, the Hull, and the Monaghan. So Halsey had his flaws, but he was truly one of the greatest fighting admirals that we ever had. Perhaps the next best fighting admiral we ever had was this guy, Ray Spruance, who hailed from Maryland and graduated in 1906 from the Naval Academy. As World War II began, Spruance commanded 4 heavy cruisers whose job it was to keep up with Halsey. He was with Halsey during the raids on the Gilberts and the Marshalls and Wake Island in March of 42, and he was also providing a protective screen during the Doolittle raid. At Midway, as we know, Spruance excelled and emerged from the battle to become one of America's most celebrated admirals in history. Shortly after Midway, Spruance became Chief of Staff to Nimitz, and in September of 1942, he was appointed as Deputy Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. But in August of 1943, Spruance was placed in command of the Central Pacific Task Force, which on April 29th of 1944 was redesignated as this 5th Fleet. And this is when Nimitz instituted the command swapping idea. The 2 admirals were a contrast in styles. Halsey was aggressive and a risk taker. Spruance was calculating and cautious. Notwithstanding their different personalities, however, the 2 were very close friends. The officers who worked for them, however, uniformly all said the same thing. They said, under Spruance, you always knew exactly what he was going to do next. Everything was written down and very orderly. Under Halsey, they wrote, you never knew what he was going to do, ever. With Halsey, he never did the same thing twice the same way. But with Spruance, he always did the same thing the same way every time. Spruance directed Operation Hailstone against the Japanese naval base at Truk in February of 44, in which 12 Japanese warships and 32 merchant ships and 249 aircraft were destroyed. This occurred at the same time that another part of his task force was split off and attacking in Eniwetok in the Marshalls, about 700 miles to the east. Spruance himself directed a task force of battleships, cruisers, and destroyers that left the main body to go after the Japanese ships that were fleeing Truk, sinking the light cruiser Katori and the destroyer Maikaze. Admiral Spruance, they said, commanded with deadly precision, reported an observer. Spruance had a nickname. They called him Electric Brain for his calmness, even in moments of supreme crisis, a reputation enhanced by his successful tactics at Midway. Now, after the war, Spruance was appointed, as one might expect, as president of the Naval War College, so he could pass on his knowledge to up-and-coming officers that were attending the War College. Which brings us to probably the second, or maybe the most important person in the Pacific, Admiral Chester Nimitz. Of course, at the center of it all was Nimitz. And of course, he had to come from Texas. He hailed from Fredericksburg. Now, don't let a relative come to Austin without driving them out to visit the Nimitz Museum. Originally in the family's hotel out there, it's now been expanded and expanded and expanded until today, when it's become a world-class museum spread over a few city blocks. You must take your family out there. It's really a fantastic experience and a great museum. Now, a reasonable question might be, how is it that the greatest admiral of World War II could hail from landlocked Fredericksburg? Well, it turns out Nimitz's father died before he was born, but his grandfather was around. And he had been a sailor in the German merchant marine and endlessly entertained his grandson with stories about the sea. He taught his grandson the sea, like life itself, is a stern taskmaster. Grandpa was also a Texas Ranger, and he was also a captain in the Gillespie Rifles during the Civil War. So this was a fighting family. Nimitz graduated 7th out of 114 fellow classmates in his Naval Academy class of 1905. In 1908, he was in command of a destroyer called the Decatur in the Philippines. Unfortunately, he ran that destroyer aground on a mud bank. Oops. Well, for that, he got court-martialed and he was given a letter of reprimand. He transferred to submarines, where he took command of a sub called the USS Plunger. Yep, that was the name. And then he went on to the Snapper and then the Narwhal. By 1912, he must have recovered his reputation because he was placed in charge of the Atlantic submarine flotilla. In 1913, he was sent to Germany to study the manufacturing of diesel engines in Nuremberg under the company Diesel. That's, in fact, where the diesel engine came from. So they sent him to the factory to study diesel engines. He spoke German, and this turned out to be quite useful. By the time World War I was over, Nimitz was the chief of staff to the commander of submarines in the Atlantic. From here, he went to the office of the chief of naval operations, where he was a member of the board of submarine design. Between the wars, he had various commands. Clearly, he was quite technical, as he helped develop the ship-to-ship refueling method, which would become really important during World War II. Just 10 days before Pearl Harbor, Roosevelt selected him to be the commander-in-chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet. He was promoted to admiral on December 31st, 1941, so a few weeks after Pearl Harbor. When he arrived in Hawaii, the situation, as we know, was perilous. The U.S. short of everything. The only thing going for him was that the U.S. had cracked the Japanese diplomatic code and were close to cracking the Japanese naval codes. Under Nimitz, the Pacific was divided into three: the Pacific Ocean areas, the Southwest Pacific area, and the Southeast Pacific area. When MacArthur came on board, he gave MacArthur command of the Southwest Pacific, but it wasn't long before there was friction. MacArthur proposed fighting north from Australia to New Guinea immediately, then for the Philippines, and then onwards to Formosa, or what we call Taiwan, and then to Okinawa and to Japan. But Nimitz and his boss, the chief of naval operations, Admiral King, favored island hopping back towards Japan. Roosevelt compromised and gave Nimitz everything east of the 160th meridian, and MacArthur everything to the west. But Nimitz and King, well, they just happened to own the Navy, and they only gave meager naval resources to MacArthur, making it difficult for him to get overly ambitious. Without a Navy, you can't go anywhere. Of course, this did not really stop MacArthur, and there was friction between the two for the entire war. Midway became Nimitz's chance to punch Japan in the face, and he gambled everything to spring a trap. If the Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorkton were lost, he probably would have been out of a job, and who knows what might have happened. But instead, of course, the Japanese took a pounding, which affected the naval balance for the remainder of 1942 and was crucial in neutralizing the Japanese offensive threats in the South Pacific. Later that year, with Guadalcanal going badly, Nimitz decided to get rid of Gormley and replace him with Halsey. Halsey's aggression proved a winning strategy, despite the fact that by the end of 1942, the U.S. was left with one badly damaged Enterprise and no other aircraft carriers in the rest of the Pacific. But the Japanese had taken a pretty severe mauling, and they too needed a break to consolidate their position. For Japan, this was not a very good idea, as the U.S. would only get stronger while they would only get weaker. In terms of combat, 1943 was relatively quiet, and the U.S. ended the year in much better shape than the Japanese. From the Gilberts to the Marshalls to the Marianas to the Carolines, Japan was pushed back island by island. We saw it all last week. All the while, the U.S. Navy was gaining more and more strength. A lot of American lives were lost, but Nimitz knew the only thing worse than a battle won was a battle lost. By act of Congress, passed on December the 14th, 1944, the rank of Fleet Admiral, the highest rank in the Navy, was established. And the next day, Roosevelt appointed Nimitz to that rank. Nimitz took the oath of office on December the 19th of 1944. In January of 45, Nimitz moved his fleet headquarters forward from Pearl Harbor to Guam, and it was there that it stayed for the rest of the war. By 45, Nimitz's forces launched successful amphibious assaults on Iwo Jima and then in Okinawa, and his carriers were raiding the home waters of Japan. Now, Nimitz knew nothing about the atomic bomb until February of 1945, which is actually more than Truman knew. They never told Truman about the atomic bomb before he actually became president after Roosevelt died. Now, in February of 45, Groves, director of the Manhattan Project, instructed Frederick Ashcroft to fly to Guam to inform Nimitz of the nature of the atomic bomb project. So Ashworth was a Navy admiral assigned to the project. Ashworth met privately with Nimitz to hand deliver the news. According to Ashworth, after reading the letter, Nimitz said, "Don't these people realize we're fighting a war out here? This is February, and you're talking about the 1st of August when this bomb will be available. Obviously, with the butcher's bill rising with each invasion as we were approaching Japan, it's pretty clear that Nimitz was ever more desperate to figure out a way to end the war, and he was unhappy that the bomb wouldn't be available until August." Nimitz is buried at the Golden Gate National Cemetery near San Francisco Airport. He lies alongside his wife and his longtime friends, Admiral Raymond Spruance, Admiral Kelly Turner, and Charles Lockwood and their wives. The next guy I want to talk about, Joseph Rochefort. Rochefort was from Dayton, Ohio. He joined the Navy in 1918 while still in high school without obtaining a diploma. He lied to the Navy and told them he was born in 1898 so that he would appear 21. Apparently, they didn't have very good records in those days. The Navy sent him to Steam Engineering School, and he graduated in June of 1919. But while he was attending classes at Steam Engineering School, they noticed that Rochefort had a penchant for solving crossword puzzles. His supervisors suggested that he take a Navy cryptoanalysis class. Before too long, he was full-time in crypto business, and he was working for Agnes Meyer Driscoll by 1924. He moved in 1926 to the Navy's OP-20G team in 1926 and began learning to speak Japanese. By 1929, he was fluent. From here, he ended up in San Diego at the Navy's Communications Division for much of the 1930s. But by early 1941, Rochefort was sent to Pearl Harbor to become the officer in charge. Rochefort handpicked many of his own staff, and by the time of Pearl Harbor, many of the Navy's crypto analysts, traffic analysts, and linguists were in his group. He handpicked what he thought were the best people. Rochefort's team was assigned to break the Japanese Navy's most secure flag officers code, while other Navy cryptographers in the Philippines and at OPG-20 headquarters in Washington worked on cracking the JN-25 code. It took some time, but after Pearl Harbor attack, American, British, and Dutch efforts to break into JN-25 were successful and began providing ever more useful information that could be actionable, and they began to understand Japanese intentions. By early 42, Rochefort was going for days without emerging from his bunker. In the bunker with him was the surviving members of the band off the battleship California. Rochefort needed more help, and none was available, so he settled for the band members off the sunken California. He thought maybe their musical talents might make them good at recognizing patterns in the signals. Not a bad idea. He was obsessed with decoding Japanese radio traffic and often went days without bathing, much to the unhappiness of those around him. He came to believe that the next Japanese attack would occur in the Central Pacific and convinced Nimitz of this. But the decryption team in Washington didn't agree and pressed the idea that the target was more likely the Aleutians or even Port Moresby in New Guinea. Rochefort and Washington disagreed on the date as well. Now, OP-20G began pressing Ernest King in Washington, who was Nimitz's superior, about the situation. They actually wanted Rochefort's role diminished and his access to Nimitz restricted. In the meantime, Rochefort just stuck to his guns. He thought the Japanese were going to attack in Midway, and they were going to attack in late May or early June. He recognized that they kept referring to the target as AF and hypothesized that AF was in fact Midway. One of Rochefort's staff suggested the idea of faking a message suggesting that there had been a failure of the water supply system on Midway. They suggested sending that in an unencrypted emergency warning in the hope of provoking a Japanese response. So Rochefort explained the idea to Nimitz, who approved the subterfuge, and accordingly, message traffic from Midway included a bit of fake news. The Japanese bit, and it wasn't long before a Japanese radio intercept mentioned that AF needed parts for their water purification system. The intercept also would confirm that early June was the date of the attack. Rochefort got it right and went on to head the Pacific Strategic Intelligence Group in Washington after the war. He passed away in 1985. Washington insiders never forgave him for getting it right when they got it wrong. And this petty behavior by the crypto people in Washington during the war led to him being denied the service awards he so richly deserved. But he was awarded the Navy Distinguished Service Medal. However, it wasn't until 1986 that he was posthumously awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom. In 2000, he was inducted into the National Security Agency Central Security Service Hall of Fame. Which brings us to the next dude, John Sidney Slew McCain Sr. McCain Sr. was Senator McCain's grandfather. Everyone called him Popeye. If you look at this picture, you'll see, for obvious reasons, why they called him Popeye. McCain was born in Mississippi. Rather than attending West Point with his brother, he ended up in the Naval Academy, graduating in 1906, 79th out of 116 in the class. His yearbook labeled him the skeleton in the family closet of 1906. Quite a funny name to give the guy. Between the wars, McCain became interested in naval aviation. In 1936, he graduated from flight school at the age of 52, one of the oldest to ever become an aviator. In January 41, he was promoted to Rear Admiral. He was short, gruff, liked to drink and gamble, but he was a natural and inspirational leader who was best described as someone who preferred contentious conflict rather than cozy compromise. In May of 42, he was appointed commander of all aircraft in the South Pacific. In this position, he commanded all land-based Allied air operations supporting the Guadalcanal campaign in the Solomons. Aircraft under McCain's command, including the Cactus Air Force at Henderson Field on Guadalcanal, were key in supporting the defense of Guadalcanal from Japanese efforts to retake the island. In October of 42, the Navy sent him to Washington to head the Bureau of Aeronautics. In August of 43, he became the Deputy Chief of Naval Operations for Air with a rank of Vice Admiral. He returned to combat in the Pacific in August of 44 with his appointment as commander of the Carrier Task Force 58, part of Ray Spruance's Fifth Fleet. And in this role, McCain participated in the Marianas Campaign, including the Battle of the Philippine Sea and the beginning of the Philippines Campaign. At the Battle of Leyte Gulf, when Halsey left in pursuit of the decoy force, the small group left covering the beach landings was in a bad way. And with Halsey out of position, McCain had been monitoring the original pleas for help and recognized the seriousness of the situation. He turned around his task force, which had been heading for Ulithi, and turned it around and headed back to Leyte Gulf. He got an 8-hour head start before he actually received orders to turn around Task Force 38 and head back to Leyte. This 8-hour head start made a big difference. At an extreme distance of 330 miles, McCain launched every plane that he could muster, from the Hornet, the Hancock, and the Wasp. It may have made the difference, as their arrival coincided with the Japanese turning their huge fleet around. McCain retained command of Task Force 38 through the Battle of Okinawa and raids on the Japanese mainland. He was still in command when the Japanese surrendered. Both McCain and his son, who was Senator McCain's father, were at the Japanese surrender ceremony on the deck of the USS Missouri in September of 1945. Clearly, Popeye knew he wasn't well, as he immediately flew home after the ceremony. Sadly, just 4 days after landing in the U.S., he suffered a fatal heart attack and died, and he's buried at Arlington National Cemetery. Now, many women also served in the Pacific, most often as nurses for the many Allied armies. Being captured by the Japanese usually resulted in terrible results. On February 16th of 1942, Imperial Japanese soldiers machine-gunned 22 Australian Army nurses and 60 Australian and British soldiers and crew, members of the surviving of the sinking of the Viner Brook. That's the name of the ship that went down in February 42. It was sunk off of Indonesia, off of Bangka Island. Australian nurse Vivian Bullwinkle and 2 soldiers were the sole survivors. When Bataan and Corregidor fell, 11 Navy nurses, 66 Army nurses, and 1 nurse anesthetist were captured and imprisoned in and around Manila. They continued to serve as a nursing unit while prisoners of war. After years of hardship, they were finally liberated in 1945. Large numbers of Army and Navy nurses were also stationed at a place called Sternberg Hospital in Manila. With Japan invading, 88 of these nurses escaped to Corregidor and then Bataan. The nurses who stayed behind in Manila were under the command of Lieutenant Laura Cobb, who was interned at the University of Santo Tomas for the duration of the war. 11 nurses were stayed there until they were freed from the Japanese in early 1945. Just prior to the fall of Bataan on the 9th of April 1942, the nurses serving there were ordered to the island fortress of Corregidor by General Wainwright, who took over from Dugout Doug after he left by PT boat. During the Battle of Corregidor, the nurses were stationed in the hospitals and wards in a maze of tunnels that were connected there. By April 29th, a small group of Army nurses tried to catch the last PBY Catalina flight out of the Philippines. Unfortunately, the plane broke down, and 3 nurses who were interned at the University of Santo Tomas were the only survivors from that flight. Among that group was ensign Anna Bertatitis. On May 3rd, this sole Navy nurse, among a number of Navy nurses, were evacuated aboard the submarine Spearfish. But when Corregidor fell, the rest of the nurses were all transferred to the University of Santo Tomas internment camp. This camp is described in great detail in the documentary The War by Ken Burns. Both civilians and Navy nurses were there for the duration of the war. Captain Maud C. Davison was 57 and with 20 years of service experience when she took command of the nurses and maintained regular schedule of nursing duty in the Philippines. In 43, the Navy nurses still under command of Lieutenant Cobb were transferred to a new internment camp where they established a new infirmary and continued working as a naval unit. At Los Baños, they became known as the Sacred 11. The nurses' story was dramatized in several wartime movies, including Cry Havoc, a movie made in 1943 by MGM, So Proudly We Hail by Paramount in 1943, and They Were Expendable by MGM in 1945. In January of 44, control of Santo Tomas changed from Japanese civilian hands to the Japanese army, and they remained in charge until liberation. Access to food from outside sources was curtailed, and the diet of the internees steadily was reduced, first to 960 calories and then to 700 calories. So they were being starved to death. In total, 400,000 women served in the armed forces in World War II. Around 540 died in war-related incidents, including 16 from enemy fire. Which brings me to the last person today. One really interesting story is about this woman, Claire Phillips from Oregon. On her own and completely untrained as a spy, she operated a clandestine ring under the cover of Club Tsubaki, a cabaret popular with Japanese officers stationed in Manila. Earning the nickname High Pockets because she smuggled information in her bra. She also funneled food, medicine, and other supplies to prisoners in the POW camps at Las Banas and Cabo Antan. The information went to the partisans fighting in the jungles against the Japanese throughout the entire war. Eventually, she was arrested and tried by the Japanese, and she was sentenced to death, but luckily her sentence was never carried out. She survived the war in a prison in the Philippines, in Manila. Now, these are just a few of those who would help win the war in the Pacific. Next week, we're going to take on the invasion of Okinawa and spend the whole seminar next week talking about that one battle. It was a huge battle, so it's worthy of our time to understand exactly what happened during the course of that action. And so at this point, let me open it up to questions.
Hugh says, Momsen's lung works as you already have all the air in your lungs you need to reach the surface, as it's under pressure in the sub, and it expands as you ascend to the surface. Is that correct?
Yep. So if you filled up the bag on the sub, there was plenty of air in there because, as you go up higher, that air will expand. It's under great pressure inside the sub, so you can actually breathe on your way up. So it would give you enough air where you could actually exhale and inhale while you were rising up in the water. That was the key. If you hold your breath as you're rising up from deep underneath the water, you're going to blow up your lungs, right? They're going to pop like a balloon. They'll just keep expanding and expanding. So you have to exhale. But of course, you need air to breathe. And that's where the lung came in. It had a supply of extra air, or has a supply of extra air.
So it's kind of rebreathing that air. Is that correct?
I don't know if you exhale back into the bag. I don't think you exhaled back into the bag. I think you exhaled into the water. So you inhaled out of the bag and then exhaled back into the water.
David asks, were Ike Nimitz head of the Army against using a nuclear bomb versus an invasion? And how many lives might have been saved, 100,000 or 1 million?
Wow. So I don't know if I'm not sure I ever read what Eisenhower thought of the atomic bomb, although, he was president after the war, and under Eisenhower, I would guess that the nuclear arsenal grew dramatically. So I guess I'm thinking that Eisenhower would have probably heavily supported its use. A lot of people's lives were saved. There were 2 million Americans in the Pacific lining up to invade the home islands, and they would have brought more if they needed them. So the fighting on Okinawa, which we're going to learn next week, was so awful as it had been on Saipan and all these other islands, that the Japanese were not giving up. They fought to the death. They fought like the Taliban. Women fought, children fought. When they didn't fight, they were committing suicide. They were sending out little kids with hand grenades behind their backs. They were every bit as ferocious as the Taliban, maybe worse. And I don't think they would have given up before the entire Japanese culture had been destroyed. It was really a fight to the death. Just like, we're still fighting in Afghanistan. They won't give up. I don't think the Japanese at that time would have given up. It took a shock, and the shock was the dropping of the bomb. The emperor realized that the jig was up, and it was either surrender or be wiped out. And I think he finally figured that out with the dropping of the bomb. And we're going to talk about on the last seminar in 2 weeks about how even under those dire circumstances, there was a huge number of people in the military that wanted to continue the fight. There was an attempted coup the night before the emperor was to read his speech, his surrender speech. Well, it wasn't really a surrender speech. It was more like a speech telling the population he was giving up. They didn't actually use the word surrender, which is something we're going to talk about. But anyway, the invasion would have cost countless American lives. Who knows? And it would have cost probably, I would not be surprised if it cost half the population of the islands of Japan before it was over. This is what happened on Okinawa. Half the population was killed. But I don't want to get ahead of next week's story.
Does the Nimitz Museum state correctly that the U.S., by cutting off oil and gas supplies, caused them to attack Hawaii and the U.S. in the Japanese surrender on the USS Missouri?
Well, okay, so, the United States cut off oil and steel sales, first steel and then oil, to Japan because of the invasion of China and their behavior in Korea. And they were trying to make them behave better. A person can say that by doing so, they were made more desperate, and this is what caused them to think that they needed to attack the United States. You can say that, but it wasn't the United States that told them to send their aircraft carriers over to Hawaii and attack the place. This was a decision that was solely on their dime. This is no different than saying that if we put sanctions against the Russians today because we don't like something that they're doing in the Ukraine, if they react badly and blow something up some other part of the world, you cannot say that this is our fault because we put sanctions on them in the Ukraine. It's the same problem. You cannot say that because we put sanctions on them, they had no other choice but to attack Pearl Harbor. That's not fair. That's ridiculous. I don't know who wrote that. Historians. Yeah, in case you're unaware, historians, including me, they're full of hot air, right? So they can say anything. And I'm not even a historian.
Jim asked, do you know who sponsored Nimitz' appointment to the Academy?
I wouldn't have any idea. I guess it would have been some congressman or senator in Texas at the time. I have no idea. Maybe Jim knows.
I'll let him type it in if he does. Everett asks, not a question, but tell Mr. Brooke that I read a book by Elizabeth Smith Friedman, the woman who smashed codes and learned that her office, which had cracked the Japanese diplomatic codes, reported that the Japanese would attack an unidentified target on December 7th. But because of a series of screw-ups, word did not get to the needed individuals.
Yes, we talked about how the Navy was fighting with the Army about delivering the information to the White House. Remember, we talked about that in one of our earlier seminars. There's no question that the Navy's decryption efforts and the Army's Navy, which is where she was working, were very good and very well advanced. The Friedmans, the husband and wife team, Elizabeth, the woman that you just mentioned, and her husband William, had done a very good job, along with this guy named Rosen, was it Ben Rosen? Can't remember. But anyway, they had built a machine to decrypt the Japanese codes, and it worked very well. And they were getting a lot of decrypts. In fact, you can argue, did they really have exact knowledge that the attack was coming? Not clear. But what is clear is that they did have knowledge that the intent was that they were coming in our direction. And the screw ups were this infighting between the Army and the Navy to get the information out. It was not getting to the White House properly. Remember, I told you the story that they were delivering the messages on alternate months and then alternate days, and then the Army got kicked out because they found some messages left out on the table. It was just chaos before Pearl Harbor. They were totally discombobulated.
We have an answer from Anonymous. Congressman James L. Slayton nominated Nimitz for the Naval Academy.
There you go.
Slayton, Slayton. Okay. Clyde says he wants to know about his parents. His mother was a WAC from South Dakota working in press relations for General MacArthur in the Pacific. His father was a GI from Austin in the Signal Corps. They met in Brisbane during R&R and got married there before returning to Austin after the war. Do you know much about how R&R was implemented during the war? He wants to know. They didn't talk about it.
Well, so, Australia was behind the lines. They spoke English. They had beer. The locals liked entertaining the visiting troops. And so Australia became a place where there was a lot of R&R. Of course, you were lucky to go to Australia and have R&R because oftentimes, if you read a lot of books about what these people were enduring during the war, sometimes the R&R was on some island where there was absolutely nothing to do. But you were lucky if you got to go to Brisbane and enjoy Australia, which was a regular city or a regular town. You have a pretty good time. There's they were probably quite lucky to have been sent there. Of course, it sounds like her mom was working for MacArthur, so she had a pretty good job. And obviously her father was lucky to have gotten sent there rather than one of these out islands where you arrived on the island, they gave you a case of beer and they said, well, we'll be back in a few days after your R&R is over. So, they were quite lucky to meet on in Australia, but that's purely random. Definitely random.
Ed wonders, what was Japan's overarching strategy for winning a war against the might and resources of the Allies? Were they thinking victory or a favorable settlement?
I think they were thinking that if they could give America a big bash in the nose at Pearl Harbor, they could, because the U.S. wasn't ready for a war, and they thought, like many of our enemies, that Americans are weak and not interested in standing up for themselves. They thought that if they gave us a big bloody nose, that we would sue for peace, end the embargo on oil, right? Because they wanted that stopped, and they would be able to keep at least some of their hard-fought territories in Asia that they had won, i.e., a big chunk of China and maybe the Korean Peninsula, whatever, and negotiate an arrangement where they could keep some part of what they had captured. So I don't think they had any intention of trying to actually beat the United States and then sort of occupy the United States. That seems highly far-fetched for a tiny little country, but they definitely had it in their minds that if they could give us a big smack, we might give up. And, that might have worked, but the attack was viewed as a sneak attack, which really pissed everybody off. And it became about avenging Pearl Harbor. I think it might have gone slightly differently if news of them declaring war had been passed around in the United States and then the attack had happened. That might have had more chances of success. Probably not, but you never know, right? Because you don't really know how people would have reacted. But by making it a sneak attack, there was no chance America was going to back down from that. And of course, 3 days later, the Germans declared war on America, and that was the end of that. It was a world war at that point.
This says, You previously mentioned some of the problems and mistakes the Japanese made. Are there others worthy of mention?
Oh boy, that sounds like a seminar. I think I kind of defer that to a seminar. And by the way, we made plenty of mistakes too. You know, wars are an endless series of mistakes separated by sufficient victories to actually win. You know, this is what happens in war. All kinds of bad things happen, unintended things happen, just like life.
A number of injured sailors were sent to New Zealand to live with local families to recuperate. My father-in-law went there after he was injured as a Seabee on Guadalcanal, quotes anonymous.
I didn't know that. So we were using New Zealand as a rear area recuperation area. I guess using their hospitals and billeting recovering sailors and Marines in people's homes. You know, Australia and New Zealand, they sent most of their young men to fight with Britain in Europe, and this actually was a bone of contention that Australia and New Zealand were left defenseless to the Japanese, while all the young men were sent to Europe to help England defend itself from the British. And of course, when things were going badly at the start of the war, this was causing a great deal of consternation in London amongst the Commonwealth countries, because the Australians were thinking, gee, we're going to be our army's going to be in Europe while our country's being invaded. This would have been a terrible disaster. So of course, and this is another reason why the United States sent large forces to those places to replace the men who were from Australia and New Zealand that were off fighting with England.
Okay, Richard, now if you could keep your day job but develop another seminar for us, what might it be on, and could you do that by a year from now, next fall?
Oh, sure. I would love to come back next fall and develop another series of 6. Of course, by then COVID might be over, so it would just maybe be 1 or 2 of the groups. Who knows if we'll still be all Zooming together like we have been for the last 2 semesters of OLLI. But yeah, easily I can come up with 6 more. I don't want to do this in the spring. It took so much effort to write these 6. I'd like to wait until a year from now and do them in the fall. But the 2 of the 6 are definitely going to be about Churchill and Stalingrad. The other 4, I'm open to suggestions, but otherwise I'll come up with them myself.
Okay, that's a date, next
Okay.
fall. And thank you all. I want you to know that I counted 157 people online with this seminar this week. You have delivered so much to so many of us and really improved the quality of our lives during this COVID thing.
Well,
Thank
I'm
you
happy.
so much.
I'm happy that you're interested. You know, I love doing this. As I said, I'm a frustrated history teacher, so this is kind of a fun hobby for me, and I really enjoy it. And I'm glad you are all enjoying it as well. And we'll see you next week.
One more comment. Besides, thanks for a great seminar. Linda says her father was one of those Marines who lived with a New Zealand family, and she has a New Zealand cookbook signed by the lady of the house and sent to her mother.
Wow, that's a nice keepsake. You know, you should try and track down the family, the New Zealand family. That would be really quite interesting.
Okay, that's Linda Oldfield. Go ahead and reach Richard so that he can answer, so he can solve that mystery of a New Zealand family. Thanks, everybody. See you next week. We look forward to it.
Take care. Have a nice week.